Welcome to the Arizona Author Series. This event was recorded on March 14, 2024. The Arizona Author Series is supported by the Arizona State Library, Archives, and Public Records, a division of the Secretary of State, with federal funds from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We are pleased to hear from Dr. Natalie Koch about her book, Arid Empire, The Entangled Fates of Arizona and Arabia. Natalie Koch is a professor of geography at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, and is currently a fellow at the Wilson Center. She is a political geographer who works on geopolitics, empire, and state power, especially in the Arabian Peninsula. Following her first monograph, The Geopolitics of Spectacle, Space, Synecdoche, and the New Capitals of Asia, published by Cornell University Press in 2018, her second monograph, Arid Empire, The Entangled Fates of Arizona and Arabia, was published with Verso in January 2023. We are pleased to hear from Dr. Koch and glad you can join us.
All right, thank you, Yam, for the introduction and for the invitation and the support of the Arizona State Library. I think it's a really wonderful chance to be here and to bring some of this work back to Arizona, as you will see, because I am from Arizona. I grew up in Tucson. It's always a joy to speak to Arizona audiences about this particular project. So this is a bit of a beautiful image of the cover of the Arid Empire book, which is actually coming from an Arizona Highways magazine cover from 1975. And I was really very, very pleased that we were able to get the licensing support from Arizona Highways as well to include this image because of the spectacular scenery that you see in this sort of utopian vision of what the Arizona desert could look like, and perhaps maybe for some people it does look like today. But behind this image, there's actually a lot more difficulty and challenges that come with curating this. So we'll get into a bit of that with the talk today. So this project actually got started for me many years ago. The first story that I had heard about connections, or got me thinking about connections between Arizona and the Arabian Peninsula, was from this NPR story that I heard on Morning Edition. And this was actually aired in 2015. Which said that this Saudi Arabian owned farm was growing alfalfa in the Arizona desert. I was shocked. I hadn't even imagined that we were still growing alfalfa in Arizona. I remember growing up hearing that, Arizona used to be this home of cotton production and a number of other really water intensive crops, but that somehow I thought that we had learned our ways and that we were not producing water intensive crops in the Arizona desert anymore. I simply hadn't been focusing my geographic scholarship on what was happening in Arizona. And so it was really a shock to my system to hear this story. But also because I have been working in the Arabian Peninsula, and in particular looking at agriculture in the Arabian Peninsula. And so seeing these two places, my home, Arizona, and the context where I had been focusing my professional career, the Arabian Peninsula, coming together in this way, just led me down a set of spirals in thinking about this particular case. So these farms that I'm sure many of you listening will have heard about are controlled by Almarai, which is their subsidiary. Fondemonte, Arizona, is part of Almarai, which is the largest dairy company in the Middle East. And it is sort of spread around the world. This is from their annual report in 2019, but they have different operations, and you'll sort of see those maps get produced in each individual year's annual report. Their other major operations in terms of farming are in Argentina, but in the USA, the farms that they control are primarily in Arizona. They are headquartered in Saudi Arabia, in Al Kharj. This is an area, as you can see, just south of Riyadh. And this is proper high desert dune area where they are located. But as I started to look into this particular company and what they were actually doing in Al-Kharj, I realized that there was a much deeper history to the farms there that also involved Arizona and Arizona farming ideas. So these are some of the stories that I started to unravel in unpicking this particular case to try to understand and contextualize why it was that there were now 90,000, 95,000 head of cattle in Al-Kharj that is being fed by alfalfa that is being grown in Arizona. So going back to some of these images and searching about the history of this place, the two images on the very bottom here, these are coming from a geographer who visited Al-Kharj in the 1950s, and they're color images because he took these photographs as slides, and those slides are actually held in Syracuse University's special collections. And we'll have heard I am a geographer at Syracuse University, and this comes precisely from one of my predecessors in the Syracuse University geography department, George Babcock Cressy. So his images of this particular desert location and the farming operations that were going on there in the 1950s also surprised me. I hadn't expected to see that somebody from exactly the same sort of professional trajectory as myself, a geographer at Syracuse, had these connections to this place, that he was also wandering this desert, trying to understand how water and food were connected in this particular space. So sort of through thinking about the story of George Babcock Cressy and my connections with Arizona that led me to reflect on my own role in this story, and not necessarily knowing or piecing together the way that that we as individuals come to inhabit certain deserts, how we move through certain deserts, and how we know certain deserts. That's really what brought me to reflect on my own role in this in the book, and I discuss this in more detail in the book, which essentially thinks about how it is that different deserts of the world are connected across space, but also time. So how is it that I, as a geographer today at Syracuse, am sort of following the same tracks of somebody who was also a geographer at Syracuse, visiting about 70 years before me? Part of this, and trying to make these connections visible, is about also then making the connections about empire and imperialism and colonial interconnections visible, because of my particular position as a white person growing up in Arizona. Those connections had been made. It was my whiteness was what allowed me to have those connections be invisible, that I hadn't been thinking about the sort of colonial history of Arizona. And so it's making those connections possible and visible to me as a child growing up in Tucson, and being sort of, decked out as a little rodeo girl here, going to one of my first rodeos, and sort of finding an enchantment with those colonial myths that come along with the romantic story about the white settler colonization of the lands of the Tohono O'odham nation. And this kind of history is what, again, my particular upbringing in Arizona is what made this sort of invisible to me. And the task and the challenge I think I set for myself in working on this project is to try to understand my role in this history, and what I could do to think about it differently, and to not just be trapped sort of as a puppet in a sense, who's being dressed up like a little good rodeo girl here. So how do we do that? How do we think about these difficult histories, and how do we think about that perhaps through those connections with the Middle East? So a big part of this book and the research that I did for it was thinking through the history of colonization of Arizona. And this of course, as many of you listening know, is a history of distribution of lands that were taken from indigenous people as the U.S. government sort of spread westward. And this was institutionalized through a number of different tools. Part of it was, as you can see here from one of these Santa Fe train circulars that they were trying to recruit a number of settlers to come take these lands through the homestead and desert land laws. There were a number of different ways that this was institutionally promoted by the US government, but then also corporate sponsors like the railroads, with the idea that they wanted white people from the East Coast in particular to come move to this area. Because as part of the challenges of Arizona getting statehood, that there was a view in Washington, D.C. that Arizona wasn't, quote, white enough. And so trying to recruit people from the East Coast involved getting them to imagine that they could live through agriculture and that they could do that in the desert. So for many people that were being recruited through these immigration solicitors and other sort of channels, they didn't know how to farm in the desert. They didn't know anything about the desert. They couldn't necessarily imagine what that would look like. And so there were many efforts then of different individuals to start to build this knowledge about how one might create this sort of agricultural utopia in the desert Southwest. And so these again are some of the wonderful images that the University of Arizona has a digital archive of these that are just fantastic resource to show how it was that these people from the East Coast and were being recruited to come build this agricultural paradise in Arizona, including, of course, Southern Arizona for the Settler, one of the Southern Pacific brochures. And these are just some pages from within that you see that there was a lot of cooperation with the early University of Arizona institution of the agricultural extension work that they were doing and the agricultural experiment station that they had set up in 1890. And so what their effort was to do that sort of extension work to get people who were newly located in Arizona or perhaps had been there longer but hadn't really been involved in agriculture to start to do this kind of work and to build the knowledge and expertise of how one might farm in the desert. So this all sort of comes back in a sense in the way that some people may have read about the various linkages between the land grant institutions, the land grant universities, and taking the indigenous lands and then giving those to higher ed institutions to sell off and build their endowments on. And so University of Arizona is very much connected with this history. And for anyone who has not yet seen it, I very highly recommend Bobby Lee and Tristan Otone's article, Land Grab Universities, that came out in High Country News in March 2020. And what they sort of document and what the broader history about these land grant institutions shows is that this sort of wealth of the university is built on that theft of land. And so trying to understand then how that actually is operationalized and works in Arizona, many people I think sort of focus on this idea that this was just outright theft. It was really negative, and it is often framed in a very negative sense. But what you can actually see if you look at the history of the University of Arizona is that this is built on a different story. It's built on a spectacular, positive, wonderful story that they're bringing science and they're bringing modernity and they're building that sort of shining utopia that you could see on that opening image of the slides, that this was possible. And so it's a sort of positive spin that they give to the idea of what they are doing by bringing this sort of institution and the colonial state of the United States and its institutions through these sorts of projects. And so it's in this that you have this construction of the desert in particular as this kind of laboratory space. And in this treatment then of the desert as this positive space of science and possibility and spectacle and desert expertise, that was a very important part of the early colonial efforts of settlers in Arizona. And of course, the agricultural experiment station, it plays an important role in this. So one of the things that these entrepreneurs at the University of Arizona figured out from very early on was that they didn't necessarily know how to help farmers. And so the first person who got put in charge of the agricultural experiment station, he just sort of toured the state and spoke with different farmers and asked them what they could use, what they could do to support them. And farmers at this point in time, and we're talking about the early 1890s, they were really interested in fruit. And in particular, they were interested in dates. And that was for a number of reasons. I don't have the time to really go into that at length today, but I'm happy to take questions on it. That dates were actually a really important commodity in the United States at this point in time. And so the farmers in Arizona thought, well, dates would be great. There's no real domestic market for that. And we have to, at this point in time, import all of those dates from the Middle East. And so they start to think about the Arizona Agricultural Experiment Station people, they start to think about, okay, well, there are lessons from the Middle Eastern countries, what they call the old world deserts, that we could take and we could use to help develop agriculture and help colonize these new lands, the new deserts, the new world deserts. And so this is where you really start to see those connections of imagining how it is that the Middle Eastern knowledge and expertise and products like trees and dates could be brought and domesticated on Arizona territory. And in so doing, help those farmers that had that they were trying to encourage to set up and build this new sort of utopian space in the Arizona desert. So they import a number of these date varieties from various places around the world. And in the book, I talk more about the case of Oman, which is where the first date palms came from, Muscat. Later on other parts of Northern Africa. So this idea of the desert as a sort of laboratory space, it continues. There's many iterations that I can't talk about fully here today, but it's in the book, such that you have eventually this idea of the desert as a laboratory. It's a laboratory for white settler scientists. It is not a way that indigenous knowledge is being engaged or treated in any sort of serious way. Instead, it is the settler colonial idea of substitution, of displacement of the indigenous people, such that by the time you get to this other wonderful spectacle of Biosphere 2, in the first sort of human experiment that where they had people, the biosphereans, being locked inside for 18 months to see if they could survive in this enclosed space. By the time you get to this point, you have these biosphereans going through this, it really, in my mind, absurd spectacle of having this blessing from a Crow elder that is here put in the Arizona Daily Star image that they also kindly have granted me permission to use, where here you don't have that serious engagement again with indigenous science and knowledge and familiarity with the land, but a treating of that indigenous figure as an icon, as a mascot. And that's how that sort of desert as a laboratory image gets to be produced in Arizona. And that sort of evolution over time, it continues in a number of ways, unfortunately, at the university today. But that's neither here nor there for today. We'll sort of stay focused on this idea of agriculture in particular, but I'm happy to talk about that as well if people have more questions about it. But in this early time, so sort of going back to this earlier time, you have this idea of the sort of Arid Empire that is being developed in Arizona soils that is coming to be seen not just as a laboratory, but as an exemplar, this exemplary laboratory space where you can show how we can colonize the desert, we can create agricultural possibilities through curating the land, moving water through these sort of channels, dams, other ways of groundwater pumping. This is a wonderful image from 1897 from Yuma, where you have this introduction of a number of different ways that water is taken and manipulated and moved and controlled in certain ways that enables this sort of agricultural possibility within the desert Southwest. And it is through this sort of water expertise that these experts from the University of Arizona and beyond are able to then sort of sell this idea back to the Middle East somewhat later, to show that this is a model that leaders in the Arabian Peninsula and other parts of the Middle East can take from the Arizona experience. And so this works certainly through the University of Arizona networks, and that content is mostly, I'll leave that to anyone who wants to read the book. But for now, I just want to tell a bit of the story of Saudi Arabia so that we can come back to the case of the Saudi farms that I mentioned at the beginning. But in order to do that, we sort of have to go to the story of Carl Twitchell, who was actually a mining engineer, and he actually got his start in copper mining in Arizona in the 19 teens is when he was living in Arizona. And at some point he got sent over to Saudi Arabia. Long story, I'll just leave that off for now. But he quickly gets in with the first Saudi king, Ibn Saud, and becomes a kind of royal advisor to Ibn Saud. And what he noticed is that every time he mentioned his time in Arizona and what the Americans were doing to build this new civilization in the Arizona desert, from what he described as nothing, that this was kind of enchanting to the new Saudi king, that he wanted to imagine how he could do that in Saudi Arabia. And so he enlists Twitchell, or Twitchell enlists himself. There's multiple directions on that, to help introduce these American approaches to desert farming to Saudi Arabia. And so he gets US government support to send this first United States agricultural mission in 1942, which Carl Twitchell is, of course, conveniently head of the mission. And in this, he really understands that helping the Saudis to develop this big new farming operation would be key to other US mission and goals of working with Saudi Arabia at this point in time. Now, 1942, we are talking about middle of World War II, right? The US has a number of concerns and interests in Saudi Arabia, including, of course, airfields and other sort of military aims. But Twitchell's point is, if you can get the US government to sponsor this and do this really, positive type of project of developing agriculture in the desert, this will help sort of create those possibilities of future connections. And that's exactly what he does. So at first, it was the Saudi Aramco, the Saudi oil company. Now it's called Saudi Aramco. Before then, it was called just Aramco. It was the American oil company. They had been taking over this farm and farming operations in Al Kharj farms. So Al Kharj is that same place. You'll remember this from the Al Marai Dairy Company. And they had this farm there, and in particular, because this was kind of a royal retreat. It was a royal farm that Aramco had been helping the king with. And so Twitchell gets the US government to then sponsor this mission that he knew at that time that this was primarily something that the king really just wanted to get help with setting up Al Kharj. But of course, they framed it as a broader mission around all of Saudi Arabia. But if you look at Twitchell's diaries, he spent the vast majority of his time with his team in Al Kharj, and like the vast majority of his work and efforts were thinking about how you could develop Al Kharj as a model farm, kind of that idea of the exemplar in the desert as a possibility for educating other farmers outside of the region, but really actually just sort of helping the king develop his pet farm. And so there's multiple things that come out of that 1942 mission. I'll sort of just quickly talk about one of those outcomes is that in 1943, the two Saudi princes, Prince Faisal and Prince Khalid, were brought to Arizona to tour the different agricultural facilities, and in fact, they didn't do all that much. And Twitchell was kind of upset about this. He thought that this was a lost opportunity, that the Arizona leaders should have done much more to woo the princes and to show them the possibilities of what Arizona had done in developing agriculture. But this was kind of a failed visit, and in fact, I could find very little about it in the Arizona newspapers. The other main thing that sort of came out of this is that as a follow-up to the first ag mission, they convinced the US government to send a team of Arizona farmers back to Saudi Arabia. And so this team, led by David A. Rogers, and two of his friends from Arizona, two high school friends actually, they were all from Skull Valley, Arizona, that they were brought then to Al-Kharj in 1944 to 45 was when they were there. So I think it was an 18-month mission or so that they were brought back to that exact same place, Al-Kharj. Rogers had seen in Arizona the really strong images and ideas of getting wealthy off of growing alfalfa. He had seen that in Arizona, and the connections in particular with the cattle industry and the possibilities of alfalfa as a cattle feed. So he really tried to expand the alfalfa production among other types of crops in Al-Kharj when he got there. And so these are some of the images, as I said, from my predecessor at Syracuse University, George Babcock Cressy, where you can really see that those green forage crops were key to what they were trying to introduce in Al-Kharj. And so one of the reasons that they were targeting Al-Kharj in particular is that they had substantial groundwater reserves in this area. And so that's these sort of sinkholes that you could see on the bottom right here. And so the Arizona team was also really tasked with bringing the Arizona technology and approaches to moving water and water extraction and machine water extraction, because before they were just using donkeys. And so the idea was that the Arizona experts could bring this and help set this up and modernize this and introduce alfalfa there. So they do this. They start to produce lots of different vegetables, other sorts of things, crops, the alfalfa, etc. But this was primarily for royal consumption. This was not distributed to the masses. In fact, there were lots of anxiety-filled reports about how workers were trying to sell the food to their local communities, but that was considered theft. That this food was property of the king, and then it was actually when it was being sent where it was supposed to be, it was just going to royal family members in Riyadh. Besides that, the king also kept a lot of his horses there, and the alfalfa that they were growing was largely for the horses. It was somewhat later then that cows and the dairy industry was introduced precisely to Al-Kharj. And that actually we'll come back to Arizona now, because there was a second royal visit to Arizona in the 1940s, in 1947. And this is really the birth, I think, of the Saudi dairy industry as we know it today. So this visit got much more attention in the Arizona press. So it was 1947, and the reason it got more attention is because it was Crown Prince Saud al Saud, whereas when his brothers went, they were not his brothers, but his family members who were kings later. Crown Prince was a much more high-profile visitor, and his tour was also specifically targeted at all of the different agricultural sites within Arizona. So he tours a number of different places. There's some wonderful images from ASU's library that shows the royal party going around Boulder Dam, what we now know as Hoover Dam, seeing different, tripsing around in ditches around Arizona, and otherwise just sort of whining and dining with the Phoenix elites. And they really did come out in full force. You can sort of see that there. And this was a much more concerted effort, that they understood that there was a great deal at stake in building this positive relationship with the Saudis in 1947. And beyond that, the Crown Prince visited other parts of the United States, not too many others, but I think it's really this picture from Beltsville, which is where the ag department is, really sort of shows that this relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia wasn't always just about oil and weapons, right? That there is this kind of agricultural connection to this. And this is often overlooked, I think, because of the outsized role of oil and military connections. But this kind of underpins that, this sort of joyous laughter that you see here of the Crown Prince and Secretary of Agriculture Anderson, just so joyously laughing together and having the chicken in hand. It gives a bigger sense of how that relationship has unfolded. But the other big piece that comes out of this, which is often sort of, again, overlooked, is that as a result of that visit, when Saud became king, just a few years after he made that visit to Arizona, when he became king, he got put in charge of the farm. And he asked the Aramco, because Aramco, the oil company, took over the farm again after the American farming team of David Rogers left. He asked them to set up a grade A dairy like he had seen in Arizona. And so it's with that then that you had the introduction of dairy farming in Al Kharj, and this became a very quick hit. The royal family loved it. One of the multiple sort of royal elites got put in charge of their own farms, and Al Kharj became home to the sort of beginnings of a modern dairy industry within Saudi Arabia. I don't have time to go over all of the history of Saudi agricultural development, but let me tell you, it's complicated, and it's fascinating for a number of reasons, many of which sort of parallel the resource challenges of Arizona. But they're also very different, because you're talking about a context where they have huge amounts of oil money that are subsidizing these programs to develop agriculture. Whereas in the United States and in Arizona, I think you have agricultural subsidies working from different mechanisms. But in Saudi Arabia in particular, you have this huge push to develop farming and agriculture to sort of have subsistence agriculture. But this is much more than subsistence agriculture. This eventually becomes export oriented, such that by the 1980s, Saudi Arabia is one of the largest wheat exporters in the world, because of the sort of skewing effect of these subsidies. And coming out of this, also, big dairy thrives. And that includes Almarai, that company that is now farming in Arizona, which was established in 1977. And so these big dairy operations do thrive, in fact, and this is sort of a longer evolution over several decades. And that is made possible because of the oil money that is subsidizing a number of different activities, and in particular the subsidies to grain production domestically. This can only last so long. This can only last as long as the water lasts. And in fact, by around, I would say around 2006, 2007, you start to see the beginning of an awareness that there could be a problem with water supplies, groundwater supplies in Saudi Arabia. By 2015, the government announces that it will be banning domestic forage production, so green forage like alfalfa and wheat and other things like this. They were outright banned, and that ban went into effect in 2018. In 2018, you can also see the announcement from Almarai that they were very proud to say that they had met the government expectation that they eliminate forage production, and that in fact these imports will originate from different locations, including the USA, Argentina, etc. And so it is through the Arizona farms that Saudi Arabia is saying, well, we're dealing with our groundwater shortage problem. And of course, as many of you listening from Arizona know, this is a problem for Arizona itself as well. And so that Gulf dairy continues to thrive thanks to those imports. But of course, that's kind of a complicated story, and it could be changing very soon. So just a quick explainer on why in particular Saudi Arabia would be interested in Arizona farms in particular. I could go into this explanation much longer than I will today, but in short, there's this sort of push factors from Saudi Arabia side saying farmers aren't allowed to grow the forage in Saudi Arabia, but they don't want to completely kill the dairy industry. As I said, the Almarai and a number of the other dairy producers are huge economic forces within Saudi Arabia. So they don't want to completely kill it. And so instead, what they do is provide subsidies for different agricultural firms to get land internationally. And so you have a shifting of those subsidies to foreign land acquisition, amongst other things. The other thing that they particularly wanted was to invest in land in what was considered politically stable contexts. So other deals in Africa or in Southeast Asia had gone south previously. And so investors didn't want to have this reaction to, oh, the Saudis are coming, they're going to kick us out, or they're not going to agree to the terms that we want. Arizona is unique in this sense, in that it was sort of seen when this deal was set up in 2014 as being politically stable, because as many people had often told me when I first started asking people about this, Arizona water politics is so complicated. It's like a Jenga puzzle that if you pull one piece out, then the whole thing collapses, and therefore nobody wants to pull anything. So this was the sense of that kind of political stalemate, even though people knew there was a problem with water policy in Arizona, that nobody felt they could move. And so, again, when I first started asking people about this in Arizona, they would say, well, I mean, if it's just one Saudi farm, it doesn't really matter. Just let it be. We can't touch all of these other issues. And so this was sort of seen as for the investors a possible place where you could have a lasting development set up. The other final point that I'll mention that is not explicitly on the slides here is that alfalfa grows very fast in places where there's plentiful sunshine and you have just as much water as you want. And so the places where they located those farms are outside of active management areas. This means that in these counties where the Saudi farms are located, they do not have regulations on the amount of water that is being pumped from that land. So as long as you have a well permit, you can pump as much as you want. So when the Saudis acquired these farms in 2014, they applied for 15 new well permits and were granted them, and began to pump away and continue to introduce some of those new wells, and doing so really at quite an impressive scale. So these are images. I brought my brother out there with his drone to take some photographs with me quite a couple of years ago now. But you can see that these are high power pumping operations that are now going on there. This had sort of been quiet. I mean, there had been a few investigative reports about this around 2015, some commentary about it, but relatively little public attention. It really broke into public awareness much more firmly and loudly in around 2022. There are a number of reasons for that. Of course, the elections in summer 2022, Arizona Republic, which has been doing some fantastic investigative reporting on this, had issued a number of reports about the Butler Valley farms. There were just a range of different issues that sort of brought this into Arizona's awareness. And this has been sort of the news cycle that has been unfolding, really continuing until today. And in fact, in October, when Katie Hobbs and Chris Mays, they both had built their campaigns on talking about the Saudi farm issue and promising to do something about that. So by some months into Katie Hobbs's administration, she announced that she was ending these land leases in Butler Valley in particular. And just there's another article from last week, also from Arizona Family, talking about how those farms' impact has been reduced. So I think that's great in one level, but my concern from the beginning, and what I think you can continue to see from this reporting, is that they are talking about one very small piece of where the Saudi dairy company Al Marai has their farming operations. So if you look at this is from one of the Washington Post reporting, this particular spot, this Butler Valley area, is actually only a very small part of where the Saudis are farming in Arizona. So that's where that little red circle is. Those are the Butler Valley farms that have been canceled, and hopefully the Saudis will be leaving and departing very quickly. There's a much larger spot which is not on state land, where they are still farming. And these, if you read some of the reporting, actually says very explicitly that these farms are not being touched. So that's just a point to keep in mind for anybody who is concerned about this issue, that this is not the end of the Saudis in Arizona. This is maybe one piece of it, but this is not the end of it. As you can see, this is a much larger operation, and these farms continue and are there still today. All of that said, I just want to sort of come back to that earlier part of the story about the sort of history of colonizing Arizona, that we need to be careful about not just sort of collapsing this into a story of Saudis stealing Arizona's water, that this is just the evil victim, or the evil forces coming from outside, and we are the victims. In fact, there is a much deeper history to it, and questioning, well, from the very beginning of Arizona's colonization, that this is also a story of the Arizona territory becoming a state, and the US government becoming the political entity that is in control of this territory, that is subverting Indigenous authority and Indigenous sovereignty and control over Indigenous resources in this particular area. That this is stolen land. These are also stolen resources, as my colleague Andrew Curley, a geographer at the University of Arizona, has described in one of his wonderful articles, that resources is just another word for colonialism. That in fact there are much deeper issues with these resources and their misallocation and allocation within the context of Arizona today, that can get erased when we just say, oh, the Saudis are coming to steal our water. Well, who are we, and what is ours? Those are the much more difficult questions that people, I think, in Arizona have to be grappling with today. So just some concluding notes here, that I think when we think about this colonization and crafting of the US Southwest as this kind of laboratory space, this is a space of extraction, of resource extraction. And it's that kind of extractive mentality that the Arizona farmers and other parts of the US government and Aramco, the oil extraction that we see going over to Saudi Arabia, this is all built on a kind of extractivism, that this is not about sustainability and life and the sort of existence for the good of the planet, that this is for commercial profit and commercial industry. So this sort of story of Arid Empire that I'm telling in the book is very much about the sort of colonial and commercial forms of agriculture and how that gets crafted in these desert spaces through this idea of desert expertise, and selling this as a sort of positive thing that the colonizers, the quote unquote civilizers, have brought to the desert. That civilization is a civilization of extraction and profit. And with that, I think it is also really important to just keep in mind that this sort of form of empire is always international, right? Because these people and things are moving across the globe in very complicated ways. But when it comes to the desert and how you imagine taking over somebody else's desert lands, there's a a form of knowledge that is brought and produced in that process. And I think it's this story of the connection of how that Arid Empire was built in Arizona that I try to tell in the book. This is very much connected to the history of the Arabian Peninsula and knowledge of these quote unquote old world deserts being brought to this new world desert, and how that then is repackaged and resold back to the Arabian Peninsula, and continues there today. And so in thinking about this is another one of George Babcock Cressy's images from Saudi Arabia when he visited in 1954. Is he has this beautiful picture here, which he just calls camel coke double exposure. And what I so love about this is that when we look at this image of a double exposure, we often think of it as it's an error, right? Something went wrong with the production here. But in fact, as I think that we can actually take a lot from this and say, no, this kind of past and present coexisting here, and the complicated story about how the Arizona farmers informed this farming operation that then is coming back to Arizona later, that if you see double, if you continue to see the past and the present together, you can't just fall into these easy narratives of victim and victimizer, that it is a much more complicated colonial present that we inhabit today. So with that, thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much. That was so informative and comprehensive, I think. I mean, I'm sure folks have questions, but that was really wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so let's get into some questions. Attendees are welcome to type them into the Q&A at any point. So the first question is, and you sort of answered it, with Governor Hobbs shutting down the Saudi alfalfa farm because of the water issues, will the Saudis try to find another state where they can find a receptive government to support another alfalfa farm, or perhaps there's another university that could replace the support of the University of Arizona?
Thank you for this question. And sorry to go so quickly back through all the slides. As you can see here, the farms that they currently have, and I think some of the larger farms actually are in Argentina. So I think it's very possible that they would continue to develop the farming operations in Argentina. And actually just a couple of months ago, I was talking with an Argentinian colleague who lives in the Arabian Peninsula. And he was saying that in Argentina, nobody is talking about this. So I think as a result, unless it becomes a political issue in Argentina, and I think with their new president, who knows? It's kind of it's possible that they would just try to push more development there. They have, so as you can see in this particular image, they had in 2019 farms in Romania. I actually don't know what the state of that is. They've had farms in Ukraine. They've had farms in other parts of Eastern Europe that have come and gone. And so I have a sense that they would like to produce more in Eastern Europe, but of course the political instability with Ukraine, etc. This is making it much more complicated. So my general sense is that they probably wouldn't try to go another place in the United States, also for other bigger geopolitical reasons. But there would be more likely the case that they would try to do more in Argentina. Other Gulf governments, including the UAE also has farming operations right next to where the Saudi farms are. They have big relationships and farming operations in Spain. And Almarai has previously had operations there as well. So it's possible that they would try to go to Spain. Spain is also dealing with really severe water shortage problems. So it's really hard to know what they will do.
Another question is, you indicated that Saudi Arabia wanted to look at farms in less political areas or areas that are of less conflict. Given the current political climate, how do you think the Saudis view Arizona now?
Yeah, I have the sense that they are not seeing it so politically stable as they once did. so when I say this, what they were really responding to when they set up this deal in 2014 was in around 2006, 2007, there was what was sort of described as a world food crisis. As a result of that, a lot of the land deals that they had set up in other parts of the world, in particular Africa and South Asia, they saw huge protests from farmers, political deals like that they thought were secure with political leaders in those countries just were not, they were not going well. And so as a result of that, there was this sense that we can't just enter into this place and set up a new farming operation. We have to go places where there's an established farming enterprise. And so that's also what you saw with Arizona Farms. When they acquired that farm, the farms in Arizona, they were already functioning as alfalfa farms. And so it was just kind of a turnkey operation in a sense that, okay, well, it was already operating this way. People didn't necessarily protest because they didn't see that it was going to be a huge dramatic shift. But of course, when you introduce 15 new wells and you really scale up that production, it creates a water problem. So I think it has taken people some time to figure out how severe that water problem is. I mean, I think Governor Hobbs said that that the Saudis were pumping 5.3 billion. Oh gosh, I wrote this in my notes and now I've got it. I'm gonna misspeak and give you the wrong numbers here. 5.3 billion gallons of water in 2023. That's an astonishing amount of water. So once that calculus starts to shift, then yes, the politics is going to shift. And I don't think that they're going to see that as politically viable in the future.
Well, I mean, not great, but okay, next question. Given the complexity of water policy in Arizona and the apparent problems emerging with farm usage, where would be the place to start, in your opinion, in creating substantive changes? Is it the land lease restrictions already in process or something else?
Yeah, so the governor has talked about it. I think she's set up some commissions to rethink water policy in Arizona and rethinking the 1980 groundwater law. I think that's absolutely the first place to start, is saying, okay, we need to think about this at a broad level, because the big challenge to my mind is that each county, so you could have a different county in Arizona that says, yes, we would like to introduce an AMA, an active management area, here in our county. But this is very quickly sort of becoming factionalized. And so I think that the challenge with just leaving it up to the counties to sort out creates a bigger political problem. So if there is force and there's a movement and there's input and effort from the governor's office to create a coordinated effort, I think that's really one of the better places to consider that it should be a statewide thing. Because again, if you just reform it in some places, then you can move to other places, and it creates a bigger set of challenges than you might anticipate when you set out to do that at the county scale. And beyond that, I frankly think just educating people about the farming operations in Arizona is really important. As I said, I grew up in Arizona, but I hadn't been paying very close attention to what was happening with agricultural policy, and it's just not a topic that's very sexy, but we really need to be thinking about, honestly.
Next question. Part of the problem to me seems to be that deserts are seen as wastes because we can't use them for what we tend to view as valuable, growing commodities and so forth. Is the idea of deserts as wastelands rather than biomes with their own unique biodiversity and ecological processes part of the issue? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, thank you for this question. I mean, I absolutely agree. I think that there's a very long and important history of how the colonial imagination is to treat the deserts as waste. And of course that's what I grew up with, right? Like that's little me, dressed up as a cowgirl, imagining this is a place that needs to be conquered, and in Richard Slotkin's terms, a sort of gunfighter nation. That's what I was born into, and thinking that this was a territory that needed to be conquered and settled. But of course, for the Tohono O'odham, this is home. Like they imagine this as a place of home and life and possibility, and this is not a place that that should be just dismissed as a waste. That is a colonial view, and so I think to the extent that we can acknowledge that and say no, we refuse that. This is a place of beauty and bounty and life. That's really the most important place to start.
And speaking of colonialism, another attendee asked, colonialism and extraction of resources of indigenous lands has been attributed to the doctrines of discovery. Have you encountered these legal goals in taking of water resources in Arizona?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I mean, I know about this history, but I don't know it in the context of what was going on in terms of water resources in Arizona. On this, I would refer you to, as I mentioned, my colleague Andrew Curley, who's at the University of Arizona. He works on the history of Arizona water issues, and I think he would have a much better answer than me. So I will defer to his expertise there, because I don't know anything about the people bowls in water in Arizona. Sorry.
So I think we have time just for two more questions. Are foreign interests being represented in big ag in the U.S.? Does the history of Saudi Arabia and Arizona, parallel the rise of big ag in the U.S.?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so there are various foreign interests in big ag in the United States, and that can work through a number of different channels. Part of it is just that they have their own operations, as you see with Fondomonte. It's a subsidiary of the Saudi dairy company Almarai, but that means that it's an LLC in the United States, and they do that across the board of how they set up their operations. So there are other ways, of course, that you see that through the Gulf sovereign wealth funds. They invest in a number of different things. So Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, the ADIA is the big Emirati one, Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. Saudi Arabia also has its own agricultural sort of investment authority, SABIC, and what else? Qatar Investment Authority has huge agricultural holdings. So they sort of work in a number of different financial circuits. So yes, they are very much present. The other thing I would just quickly point out is that Saudis very often come and have historically studied at the University of Arizona and have studied in the ag school in particular. So many of the Saudi agricultural leaders, like people in the agriculture ministry in Saudi Arabia, they have their education from Arizona. So it goes both ways. The sort of Arizona approach to agriculture and desert ag is represented in Saudi Arabia through those people as well.
Yeah, that adds such an interesting layer to it all, right? Because it's not just the agriculture, it's the cultural exchanges.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So last but not least, you alluded to dates being an important commodity. Can you elaborate on that in a few minutes about that?
Yeah, so I'll be very quick because I think we're short on time. There's more in the book on this, but in the like early 1800s, the United States started to import dates from abroad, and most of those were coming from the Middle East, in particular Iraq and Oman. Those were the major two exporters of dates. It became like dates. They were not like what you imagine as a single date that you might eat today. They were shipped in these big blocks, like these big congealed blocks, and they would only arrive in particular seasons. So they would arrive around Thanksgiving, Christmas time, and so it became a kind of Christmas tradition that you would go and you would get your slice of this block for the Christmas holidays. That was a big cultural sort of thing, and so there was news that was newspapers were reporting on when the next boats were coming. There was a date race of which boat was going to be the first one to arrive in the United States. And it became this really important sort of fixture of the holiday season. There were two big things started to change, though, that sort of ended that American relationship with dates, that we just don't think of dates, I think, in anything close to the same way today. One is the wider availability of sugar. So there were not really good wide uses of sugar in the United States for an extended period of time. So that started to shift. And the other thing that started to shift is the fact that the United States set up its own date production within the US. And it was great reading some of these notes and stories from the Date Growers Association, when one person in particular sort of gets up at the Growers Association meeting and says, look, guys, we can sell these dates all year round. We don't have to be limited to Christmas. And so it's kind of that idea that dates are constantly available and more widely available, that seasonality and the cultural cachet about Christmas time and this being a Christmas festivity, that starts to fall away. So yes, there's much more to that, and it's also in the book. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen a little bit. Mm-hmm. Final slide. Mm-hmm. All right. So thank you very much for your time, Natalie, and to all of our attendees for joining us today. On the screen, you'll see a link to a brief survey, which will also be emailed to you. Your feedback is greatly appreciated. The recording of this presentation will be made available on the YouTube channel, so be sure to share the link with friends who have missed today's presentation. We hope to see you at future events and in our meeting. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.